The seeker arrives at the threshold with a singular question burning in their consciousness. Why does silence hold dominion over speech in the deepest chambers of wisdom? This is not a question of mere discretion or social prudence, but a fundamental metaphysical principle that has echoed through the corridors of Western esotericism since antiquity. The Hermetic Law of Silence stands as one of the most paradoxical yet essential teachings within the initiatory traditions, a principle that demands the aspirant understand that true power accumulates not in what is proclaimed to the world, but in what is jealously guarded within the sanctum of individual consciousness. The historical lineage of this doctrine emerges from the mists of Hellenistic Egypt, where the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, encoded the fundamental laws governing both material and spiritual reality. Within the Corpus Hermeticum, particularly in the Poimandres and the Asclepius, we encounter repeated injunctions towards sacred secrecy. The adept is cautioned against casting pearls before swine, not from elitism, but from the recognition that premature disclosure dissipates the very force being cultivated. The Emerald Tablet itself, that cryptic condensation of alchemical wisdom translated and commented upon by figures from Pseudo-Apollonius to Isaac Newton, operates through veiled language precisely because direct statement would render its truths inert. This principle received systematic articulation in the three initiatic virtues proclaimed across mystery traditions: to know, to dare, and to keep silent, noscere, audere, tacere. Eliphas Levi, in his magisterial Transcendental Magic, emphasized that silence constitutes not passivity but active containment, the magician's will compressed and intensified through non-disclosure. Manly Palmer Hall, in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, traced this doctrine through Pythagorean, Orphic, and Mithraic schools, demonstrating that the oath of secrecy served not merely organizational purposes, but ontological ones. Speech dissipates force, silence concentrates it. Carl Gustav Jung approached this same principle from the perspective of analytical psychology, recognizing in the alchemical texts a sophisticated language of psychological transformation. In Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung observed that the alchemists' insistence on secrecy reflected their intuitive understanding that premature verbalization of unconscious content arrests its development. The psyche requires incubation, a sealed vessel in which transformation occurs away from the dissipating effects of collective consciousness and social validation seeking. The modern seeker confronts this teaching with particular urgency. In an age of compulsive disclosure, where every thought and experience is immediately externalized through digital media, the capacity for silence has atrophied. Yet the Hermetic tradition insists that which is spoken too soon is aborted. That which is guarded in silence gestates toward realization. The true secret is not information to be hoarded, but a state of being to be achieved, and this achievement demands the rigorous discipline of containment. The Hermetic Law of Silence does not stand in isolation, but forms one pillar within the comprehensive architecture of Hermetic philosophy. To understand its full significance, we must situate it within the broader framework of the 7 Hermetic principles as articulated in the Kybalion, that enigmatic text attributed to 3 initiates, which systematized Hermetic teaching for the modern age. The 7 principles, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, constitute a complete metaphysics. The law of silence operates as the guardian of this entire system, the seal that prevents premature externalization before internal realization has occurred. Specifically, silence relates most intimately to the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental, because it recognizes that reality responds to consciousness, and consciousness achieves concentrated power through containment rather than dispersion. Consider the alchemical framework that Jung investigated so thoroughly. The opus magnum proceeds through distinct phases: nigredo, blackening; albedo, whitening; citrinitas, yellowing; and rubedo, reddening. Each phase demands sealed vessels, controlled heat, and above all, patience. The alchemist who constantly opens the retort to check progress, or who boasts of preliminary results, disrupts the delicate process. Dennis William Hock, in his definitive work, The Emerald Tablet, emphasizes that the alchemical vessel, the vas hermeticum, symbolizes consciousness itself, hermetically sealed against intrusion, allowing internal transformation to proceed without interference from external energies. The connection to Kabbalistic doctrine illuminates another dimension. In the Tree of Life, the path from Malkuth, kingdom material reality, to Kheta, crown divine unity, requires passage through Dath, the invisible Sephira, representing knowledge that cannot be directly transmitted. Dath stands at the abyss, the great gulf separating lower and higher consciousness. The initiate cannot simply be told what lies beyond. They must undergo transformation to become capable of receiving it. Premature disclosure produces not enlightenment, but confusion or inflation, the ego claiming spiritual attainment without genuine realization. Neoplatonic philosophy, particularly as expounded by Plotinus and Proclus, reinforced this understanding through the doctrine of the ineffable one. The highest reality cannot be adequately expressed in language because language operates through differentiation, while ultimate reality transcends all distinction. The philosopher therefore practices negative theology, saying what the one is not, while maintaining contemplative silence regarding its positive nature. This silence is not ignorance, but the most precise epistemological stance available to embodied consciousness. The mentality of the true adept, then, combines three essential qualities. First, the magical will, not mere desire or preference, but directed intention maintained with unwavering focus. Aleister Crowley defined this as the true will, one's authentic purpose stripped of social conditioning and ego gratification. Second, occult ethics, the recognition that power demands responsibility, that knowledge of hidden laws creates moral obligation. The adept guards silence not from selfish hoarding, but from recognition that unprepared minds meeting advanced teachings produce psychological damage both to themselves and others. Third, methodical doubt, the capacity to question even one's most cherished realizations, to distinguish genuine gnosis from self-deception, spiritual inflation from authentic attainment. This last quality proves particularly crucial. The Hermetic tradition insists that the greatest dangers come not from external opposition, but from internal delusion. The ego's capacity to masquerade as the self, to claim spiritual achievement as personal accomplishment, to confuse preliminary experiences with final realization. Silence serves as protection against this inflation. That which remains unspoken cannot be used for ego aggrandizement. That which is internally verified cannot be destabilized by external skepticism or enthusiasm. The practice of Hermetic silence unfolds through distinct psychological stages, each presenting unique challenges and requiring specific understanding. This is not abstract theory, but operational methodology, a map of consciousness transformation that Jung recognized as representing universal patterns of individuation. Stage 1. Recognition of the profane state, the lead of ordinary consciousness. The journey begins with recognition of one's current condition, what alchemists termed the materia prima, the raw, unredeemed substance of ordinary consciousness. The aspirant recognizes that their psyche operates in a state of dispersion, fragmentation, and reactivity. Every experience is immediately externalized, shared, validated through others' responses. There exists no internal container, no sealed vessel in which experience might deepen and transform. Jung identified this as the state of unconscious identification with the persona, the social mask one presents to the world. The individual believes themselves to be their public presentation, their social role, their externalized identity. The compulsion to speak everything, to share every experience, reflects this identification. Without an internal center of gravity, the psyche seeks external validation for its very existence. The Hermetic remedy begins with the practice of deliberate containment. The aspirant identifies a significant experience, realization, or practice, and consciously refrains from discussing it. This is not mere secrecy but active cultivation of interior space. The experience, held in silence, begins to deepen. Associations multiply. Symbolic connections emerge. What seemed simple when first experienced reveals unexpected complexity when contemplated in sustained silence. Stage 2. The descent into nigredo, confronting the shadow. As the practice of silence deepens, a crisis inevitably emerges. The aspirant encounters what Jung termed the shadow, the complex of rejected, denied, and repressed psychological content that consciousness has excluded from self-image. In Hermetic terms, this is the nigredo, the blackening phase where all pretense dissolves and one confronts the raw, unidealized reality of one's nature. The compulsion to speak, previously unexamined, reveals itself as a defense mechanism. Speech dissipates uncomfortable psychological tension. Confession seeks absolution without transformation. Sharing dilutes responsibility. The aspirant who maintains silence through this phase experiences the full weight of their psychological material without the relief valve of externalization. Dreams intensify during this period. The unconscious, no longer able to discharge content through compulsive speaking, presses material into awareness through symbolic imagery. Jung observed that his alchemical patients reported dreams filled with imagery of decay, putrefaction, dismemberment, the same symbolism medieval alchemists employed to describe the nigredo. The peacock's tail appears, representing the momentary appearance of colors, insights, realizations that quickly fade back into darkness. The psychological danger here is considerable. Without proper understanding, the aspirant may interpret this intensification as pathology, seeking therapeutic relief rather than recognizing it as necessary process. The Hermetic tradition distinguishes between destructive pathology and constructive crisis, the former leading to disintegration, the latter to reintegration at a higher level. The sealed vessel of silence ensures that psychological material undergoes transformation rather than mere discharge. Stage 3. The albedo, purification and discrimination. Sustained containment eventually produces a qualitative shift, the transition from nigredo to albedo, from blackening to whitening. Jung correlated this with the emergence of the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype that mediates between consciousness and the deeper layers of the unconscious. In practical terms, the aspirant develops capacity for objective self-observation, for witnessing the movements of their own psyche without immediate identification or reaction. The practice of silence now serves a new function: discrimination. Not all that arises in consciousness merits expression. Not all insight should be externalized. The aspirant learns to distinguish between content that requires external embodiment and content that serves purely internal development. This discrimination constitutes genuine wisdom, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, based not on fear or social calculation, but on understanding of psychological process. The alchemical texts describe this phase as the washing, ablutio, the separation of the pure from the impure, the essential from the accidental. In Jungian terms, this is the development of the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites in tension until a third, reconciling position emerges. Silence provides the container within which this tension can be sustained without premature resolution through one-sided action or declaration. During albedo, the aspirant often experiences profound insights, moments of crystalline clarity where complex problems suddenly resolve, where long obscured patterns become visible. The temptation to immediately share these realizations is intense, both from genuine enthusiasm and from ego's desire for recognition. The Hermetic discipline demands continued silence. These insights must be tested against lived experience, integrated into behavior, verified through their fruits rather than their initial glamour. Stage 4. The citrinitas, solar consciousness and directed will. The yellowing phase, though often compressed or omitted in simplified alchemical schemes, represents a crucial intermediary stage, the dawn before full illumination. Jung associated this with the development of conscious relationship to the self, the archetype of wholeness and ordering center of the psyche. The aspirant begins to operate not from ego will, but from alignment with deeper purpose. Here silence transforms from discipline to natural expression. The Hermetic adept no longer refrains from premature speaking through effortful suppression, but simply has no compulsion to speak. The internal process has achieved sufficient stability that it does not require external validation. Speech, when it occurs, flows from fullness rather than emptiness, from genuine communication rather than psychological discharge. The citrinitas represent solar consciousness, the illuminated mind that sees connections, patterns and purposes invisible to ordinary awareness. Yet this illumination does not produce the inflation and grandiosity that characterizes false spiritual development. The adept recognizes their realization as gift rather than achievement, as participation in universal process rather than personal accomplishment. This humility, authentic rather than performative, naturally produces discretion. One does not boast of breathing or seeing. These are simply natural capacities. Similarly, the developed adept does not proclaim their attainment because it has become their ordinary state of being. Stage 5. The rubedo, integration and embodied wisdom. The reddening phase represents final integration, what Jung termed individuation's culmination in the realization of the self. The previously separate aspects of psyche achieve harmonious relationship. Conscious and unconscious operate in dynamic cooperation. The aspirant embodies their realization in practical life, manifesting wisdom through action rather than proclamation. The law of silence here achieves its ultimate significance. The individuated person speaks when speech serves genuine purpose. Education, assistance, authentic communication. They remain silent when silence better serves, allowing others their own discovery, avoiding inflation of ego, protecting sacred experience from profanation. This discrimination flows naturally from developed consciousness rather than from external rules. Alchemically, this is the philosopher's stone, not a physical substance, but a state of being that transmutes psychological lead into gold, that transforms suffering into meaning, that converts raw experience into refined wisdom. Jung emphasized that this stone represents the realization of one's complete nature, the achievement of psychological wholeness that includes rather than excludes shadow material, that integrates rather than suppresses the repressed. The Hermetic adept at this stage becomes, in Levy's phrase, a master of silence and speech, one who understands both the power of the spoken word and the greater power of the unspoken truth. They recognize that premature revelation does not serve others but often harms them, creating either dependency or skepticism rather than genuine understanding. True teaching occurs through exemplification, through being what one has become, allowing others to recognize possibility through embodied presence rather than verbal proclamation. Every authentic spiritual path includes a period of profound crisis, what mystics term the dark night of the soul, what alchemists recognized in the Nigredo's deepest phase, what Jung encountered in his own confrontation with the unconscious and documented in the Red Book. This crisis is not pathology but necessity, not obstacle but gateway. Yet its nature is so devastating to ordinary consciousness that many seekers encountering it retreat into conventional life or regress to superficial spirituality. The specific crisis produced by the practice of Hermetic silence possesses unique character. Unlike the dark night that emerges from contemplative practices or the existential crisis that follows the collapse of worldly ambitions, the crisis of silence arises from the complete withdrawal of external validation and the consequent confrontation with one's internal void. Modern consciousness has become entirely dependent on external mirrors for its sense of reality. We speak, therefore we exist. We share, therefore we matter. We receive response, therefore we have substance. The aspirant who rigorously maintains silence discovers a terrifying truth. Without external validation, the sense of self begins to dissolve. The persona, revealed as mere social construction, loses coherence. The ego, deprived of its usual reinforcements, experiences a kind of psychological starvation. This is not the gradual dimming of a light, but the sudden collapse of an entire edifice. The aspirant may experience depersonalization, the sense that they are not real, that their consciousness is somehow detached from reality. They may suffer derealization, the perception that the world itself has become strange, distant, fundamentally ungraspable. These experiences, while sharing phenomenological similarities with psychiatric dissociation, differ in teleological purpose. Pathological dissociation fragments consciousness defensively. Initiatic dissolution clears space for reconstruction at a higher level. The alchemical texts describe this phase with graphic imagery: the death of the king, the putrefaction of the corpse, the descent into the tomb. The Rosarium Philosophorum depicts the royal couple drowning in the philosophical sea, their bodies decaying in the sealed vessel. Jung recognized these images as representing the death of the ego's dominance, the dissolution of one-sided consciousness that precedes the emergence of the self's ordering function. During this crisis, the temptation to break silence becomes nearly irresistible. The psyche seeks relief through confession, through sharing the burden, through receiving reassurance from others that one is not going mad. Yet the Hermetic discipline insists on maintaining containment precisely through this most difficult phase. The crisis itself is the crucible. The dissolution is the necessary precondition for reconstitution. The philosophical distinction between this Hermetic crisis and modern pathology deserves emphasis. Contemporary psychology, operating from a medical model, interprets psychological suffering primarily as symptom requiring relief. The Hermetic tradition recognizes a category of suffering that is not pathological but developmental. Pain that serves purpose, crisis that produces growth, dissolution that enables higher integration. This is not to romanticize suffering or to discourage seeking help when needed. The distinction lies in teleology and context. Suffering that arises without framework, that produces only disintegration, that offers no meaningful relationship to development. This requires therapeutic intervention. Suffering that emerges within a coherent practice, that follows recognizable patterns documented in initiatory literature, that ultimately, though perhaps only after considerable time, produces increased functionality and wisdom. This constitutes initiatic crisis rather than pathology. The aspirant in this phase requires not conventional therapy, but what might be termed hermetic accompaniment, guidance from one who has traversed this territory, who can distinguish pathological deterioration from necessary dissolution, who can offer framework for understanding the experience without prematurely relieving its pressure. The Hermetic tradition's emphasis on lineage, on teacher-student relationships, on initiated guidance, addresses precisely this need. The crisis resolves not through external intervention, but through internal breakthrough. The moment when the aspirant ceases seeking external ground and discovers internal ground. When the dissolution of ego-based identity reveals the presence of something deeper, more stable, more authentic. This breakthrough cannot be forced or predicted. It emerges in its own time, when the psychological material has been sufficiently worked, when consciousness has achieved sufficient flexibility, when the sealed vessel's internal pressure produces transformation rather than explosion. Jung described his own emergence from this crisis as discovering that the psyche has its own reality, independent of ego's constructions or social validations. The aspirant practicing Hermetic silence discovers similarly. There is a witness consciousness that persists even when the entire structure of conventional identity dissolves, a ground of being that does not depend on external recognition for its reality. The aspirant who successfully navigates the initiatic crisis emerges transformed. This transformation is not merely psychological, but ontological, a fundamental shift in the ground of being, in the source from which consciousness operates, in the relationship between self and reality. The philosopher's stone, that supreme goal of alchemical endeavor, reveals itself not as magical ability or supernatural power, but as a stabilized state of consciousness characterized by specific qualities. First, integrated awareness, the capacity to hold conscious and unconscious content in dynamic relationship, to access symbolic and rational thinking with equal facility, to move fluidly between different levels of consciousness without losing orientation. Second, ethical clarity, not adherence to external moral codes but spontaneous right action flowing from alignment with one's true nature and recognition of interconnection with all being. Third, creative potency, the ability to actualize potential, to manifest intention in material reality, to bridge spirit and matter through conscious will. Jung termed this state individuation, the realization of the self as distinct from ego. The individuated person does not transcend personality, but includes it within a larger wholeness. The ego continues to function as the center of conscious awareness, but it no longer claims autonomy or ultimate authority. It recognizes itself as servant rather than master, as executive function implementing the self's deeper purposes rather than sovereign ruler pursuing its own agendas. The law of silence achieves its full significance in this realized state. The adept understands that genuine power operates through being rather than doing, through presence rather than proclamation, through silent influence rather than explicit instruction. They recognize that premature teaching aborts understanding in the listener, that authentic transmission occurs through resonance rather than information transfer, that the deepest truths cannot be spoken but must be realized through individual journey. This produces a particular ethical stance toward others. The adept does not proselytize, does not seek to convince or convert, does not impose their realization on those unprepared to receive it. Yet neither do they withhold assistance from genuine seekers. They become, in the Hermetic phrase, silent as the grave to the profane, but open as day to the initiate. Recognizing that true teaching requires discrimination, that wisdom must be protected from those who would misuse or trivialize it, while being freely shared with those prepared to honor and apply it. The practical applications for the modern individual are profound. In an age of compulsive disclosure and performative authenticity, the integrated person cultivates genuine privacy, not secrecy born of shame, but conscious discretion born of understanding. They recognize that not all experience requires or benefits from externalization, that the deepest aspects of life are often diminished rather than enhanced by public sharing. In professional life, this manifests as strategic communication, speaking when speech serves purpose, remaining silent when silence better serves goals. The integrated person does not compulsively share their thinking process, their strategies, their intentions. They allow actions to speak, allow results to demonstrate capacity, allow others to recognize wisdom through its fruits rather than its proclamations. In personal relationships, this produces authentic intimacy, the capacity to share deeply with appropriate others while maintaining internal sanctuary. The integrated person does not compulsively disclose everything to partners or friends, but maintains conscious relationship to what is shared and what is held private. This is not emotional withholding, but recognition that individuals require internal space for self-relationship, that genuine intimacy includes respect for the other's interiority and mystery. In spiritual development, the realization of the law of silence protects against two common deviations. First, spiritual materialism, the ego's appropriation of spiritual attainment for purposes of social status and self-aggrandizement. The person who maintains silence about their practices and realizations denies ego this gratification, ensuring that development proceeds from genuine aspiration rather than desire for recognition. Second, premature teaching, the impulse to share newly acquired insights before they have been adequately integrated and tested. The discipline of silence ensures that one speaks from embodied wisdom rather than intellectual understanding, from lived realization rather than conceptual grasp. The responsibility that accompanies this realization cannot be understated. Jung observed that individuation produces both gift and burden. The individuated person gains access to creative power and psychological freedom, but they also assume responsibility for conscious relationship to the collective unconscious, for ethical use of increased capacity, for contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. The Hermetic adept recognizes that knowledge of hidden laws creates moral obligation. One cannot simply pursue power for personal benefit, but must consider the larger implications of one's actions, the effects of one's influence on others' development, the responsibility to use enhanced capacity in service of something beyond individual gratification. This is why the Hermetic School emphasizes not merely technique, but character development, not merely practice, but philosophical foundation, not merely attainment, but integration. The goal is not to produce individuals who possess unusual abilities, but to cultivate human beings who embody wisdom, who demonstrate through lived example the fruits of genuine inner work, who serve as living proof that consciousness can be transformed, that human potential exceeds conventional limitations, that the ancient promise of the mysteries remains valid for those willing to undertake the rigorous discipline required for its realization. The Hermetic Law of Silence stands revealed not as restriction, but as liberation, not as hoarding of knowledge, but as honoring of the sacred process through which knowledge becomes wisdom, through which information transforms into realization, through which intellectual understanding ripens into embodied truth. The adept who has internalized this principle understands that the greatest power grows not in what is spoken to others, but in what is lived in silence, not in what is proclaimed to the world, but in what is achieved in the sealed vessel of individual consciousness. The modern world, drowning in noise and compulsive disclosure, desperately requires individuals who have rediscovered the power of silence, not the silence of ignorance or repression, but the silence of conscious containment, of strategic discretion, of wisdom that knows when to speak and when to hold counsel. These individuals become anchors of sanity in a culture of compulsive externalization, living demonstrations that meaning emerges from depth rather than breadth, from quality rather than quantity, from being rather than seeming. The gold you seek is not in the crucible alone, but in the will that maintains the flame and the silence that seals the vessel until the work is complete.